Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you, Steve and the JCRC for hosting this, and the Business Partnership, the Minneapolis Foundation, and the Urban League. And thanks to all of you for being here. And please continue eating. I hope you can get through lunch while we talk, and then Steve and I are going to come up and have a conversation, then open it up to all of you to hear directly from you. I always like to start by just telling you why I'm here, and more specifically, why the Minneapolis Fed is here. I like to go back in history a little bit. Steve mentioned the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Actually, if you go back and read Chernow's book on Hamilton, you'll see that Alexander Hamilton was the first creator, or the creator of the first Bank of the United States, the first central bank of the U.S. And it lasted about 20 years, and then they got rid of it because the notion of having a central bank sounded undemocratic. A bunch of bankers in a dark room doing God knows what. It just didn't sound very democratic. So they got rid of it. Then there was a second bank in the United States, and then they got rid of that. And then in the late 1800s, the U.S. economy was hammered by banking crises. And so then Congress said, well, even though we don't like the idea of having a central bank, I guess we need to have one. But if we're going to have one, let's distribute it around the country. Let's make it structured so it more directly represents all the different regions of the country. So in 1913, as Steve mentioned, Congress created the Federal Reserve System, which is the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. I'm sure you heard about Alan Greenspan and then Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen, and now the current chairman is Jay Powell, sitting in Washington, D.C., and then 12 independent regional Federal Reserve banks, including the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, the 9th Federal Reserve Bank. And our jobs are literally to represent all of you. So I go back to Washington, D.C. Every 6 weeks when we set interest rates for the country. And a big part of my job is to know what is happening in our local economy, so I can bring this perspective back to Washington, D.C., so that our region is directly represented in setting monetary policy and financial policy for the United States of America. And so that's why there's a Minneapolis Fed, and that's why I spend a lot of my time with my colleagues traveling out around our region, which is Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and northwestern Wisconsin, to get to hear directly from constituents, from businesses, from workers, from nonprofits, from community leaders. What's happening? How's the economy going? What's happening to wages? All of this information makes us smarter, so when we go back to Washington, D.C., we can hopefully make better decisions. And so that's why I'm here, and that's why I like to structure these conversations as conversations, so that you're going to get the microphone, and I'll be able to hear directly from you what's on your mind, as it relates to immigration, but more broadly as it relates to the economy. I always tell people the more direct you are with me, the more I will learn, and the better I'll be at my job. So please don't hold back. I do really want to hear from you. And thank you again for being here. So let's talk a little bit about the topic at hand, which is immigration as it relates to economic growth. So first of all, you might ask, why is a Federal Reserve official speaking about immigration? Let me just also point out, when Steve and I talked about this a few months ago, this was long before any shutdown, right? We picked this date months ago, and it just so happens that political events have caught up to us. We were ahead of political events in some sense. They have caught up to us, so the timing is fortuitous, you might say. So we care about how do we grow the economy? How do we make the economy as robust as possible? Congress has given the Federal Reserve 2 jobs. One job is a stable economy, one that's not overheating and also limping along, and maximum employment. And that means anybody who wants to find a job is able to find a job. That's how I interpret maximum employment. And typically we think these things are linked through wages. If the economy gets really strong and businesses have to compete to find workers, they're going to bid up salaries, and then they're going to have to pass on those higher salaries in terms of higher cost to their customers. So typically we think the economy and the job market are linked through wages. So we pay a lot of attention as to what's happening. Are people able to find jobs? Are wages growing? But over the long run, so the Federal Reserve is managing ups and downs of an economic cycle. Over the long run, where does economic growth come from? It comes from 2 sources. One source is productivity growth. So that means we invent new technologies that make us more efficient for a given worker, right? Think about a word processor or your computer versus a typewriter. Those of you old enough like me to have ever used a typewriter, a word processor makes you much more efficient, so you're more productive. Productivity also comes from education, so that's why at the Minneapolis Fed we spend a lot of time looking at education policy, giving workers better knowledge, better skills to do more with the same inputs. So half of the equation is productivity growth. Half of the equation is simply population growth. More people to consume things, more people to produce things leads to higher overall economic growth. So one of the challenges that we have as a country, and that virtually all advanced economies have, is that our populations aren't growing at the same rate that they grew 30, 40, 50 years ago, simply because people are having fewer kids. Our fertility rates, as economies have become wealthier, their fertility rates tend to go down. And so we've got the productivity side of the house over here, but what about the population growth side? And if you look in American history, population growth has been a huge, or immigration has been a huge contributor to the population growth of the United States of America. And it's been a big source of our economic vibrancy that we've all enjoyed over the past 30 or 40 years. You know, we've been used to the U.S. economy growing at about a 3% growth rate year after year after year, most of the post-war period. That has now fallen closer to 2%. And a big chunk of that shortcoming is the fact that we're just not growing our workforce the way we did in prior generations. So the reason that I care about this as a Federal Reserve official is I want the U.S. economy to grow. And the question is, how are we going to get that economic growth if we're not having more kids like our parents had before? So I talk to audiences, I say, if you want the U.S. economy to grow, and you accept my premise that population growth is part of it, you really only have a couple choices. You can either try to spend a lot of money to encourage families to have more kids. People laugh when I say it, but you can subsidize fertility. By the way, Japan is trying this. You can give tax credits to families. If you have a baby, we'll give you a tax credit or free child care. There are different incentives you can put out there. By the way, it takes about 20 years to grow a new worker. I could just point that out. It doesn't happen overnight. It's also really expensive, and it's totally unclear if it actually works, if that's enough of an incentive to have families to have more kids. Or you can turn to immigration. And that's it. That's math. So I'm not here to offer you a moral judgment on immigration. And by the way, I will confess, I'm the son of immigrants, and I'm married to an immigrant. So if I were to offer you a moral judgment, it might not be an unbiased moral judgment. But you can reach your own conclusions about it. I'm just here to lay out the math. If we want the U.S. economy to grow vibrantly, we need more people. We need more workers, and we need more consumers. You can either try to spend a lot of money to pay families to have more kids, or you can embrace immigration. That's it. We at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis did a little math, and we said if we increased our immigration by about 1 million per year, which is not to record levels, it's back more to more normal historical levels, that's about a 0.5% increase in GDP growth, from 2 to 2.5. That's a huge, you add up, this is like small numbers added up over many, many years, ends up being huge impact. If our economy were to grow at 2.5% per year for the next 20 years versus 2%, it's a huge difference in the size of our economy. And that's funding things like defense, infrastructure, all of the different things that we need to invest in as a country. If you have more workers producing things, paying taxes, your country is wealthier, you're able to pay for these big, important investments that you want to make. And so I'm here today just to lay out the math, which is when you meet people who say, you know what, we need to really clamp down on immigration, say, okay, how do you plan to grow the economy? I'm in favor of economic growth. I don't know about you. How do you plan to grow the economy if immigration is not going to be part of it? And that's simply math. And again, if you look at Japan, Japan has worse demographics than we have. They're having fewer kids than we're having. And they are culturally very resistant historically to immigration. So they are trying to go down the route of let's pay Japanese families to have more kids. And it is a tough, tough road to hoe. Last thing I'm going to say, then I'm going to bring Steve up here and we're going to have the conversation, is as imperfect as we are as a society in terms of bringing people into our culture and assimilating them. And let's admit, we're not perfect. We're just better at it than anybody else in the world. Better at by far. So when you talk to immigrants around the world, where do they want to go? By and large, they want to come here. And so as flawed as we are, by and large, they want to come here. So for me, this is as close to an economic free lunch as we can have, which is people want to come here. If we design an immigration program that fit the needs of our economy, it could be a huge competitive edge for us versus all of our competing nations around the world, because there is a competition for talent. And this is a competition we have won historically, hands down, and we are positioned to win historically, hands down, going forward. So in my humble opinion, we'd be crazy not to use this advantage that we have and to take this free lunch that's right there for the taking. So that's my basic message. I'm thrilled that you're all here. I look forward to hearing all of you. If you disagree, tell me. Let's have a robust conversation. Thank you for your attention. Steve, why don't we come up and start the conversation?
Well, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask a question. Ellen Luger-Goldberg is going to ask. Ellen Goldberg-Luger is going to ask a question. Then whomever would like to ask a question will go from there. Let's start here, Neel. You wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal, January 19, 2018. I know the date well because my birthday is January 20th. So there you have it. And you reprised the theme, or maybe you're reprising it today, about free lunch with respect to immigration. In the fall, you hosted a conference, and Senator Ron Johnson was sort of your interlocutor, and you were discussing immigration issues. My question isn't so much about the substance. You'll be talking about that, and you'll be talking about it more, but it's interesting that through the Wall Street Journal, you reached out to the business community, and Senator Johnson probably can be accurately portrayed as a somewhat conservative senator from Wisconsin. So what's your strategy? Why are you reaching out to these folks? Why are you telling the story in the Wall Street Journal? Why are you bringing Ron Johnson here to talk about immigration?
Well, the interesting thing is, so after every FOMC meeting, I usually go up to Capitol Hill for a day to meet with our elected representatives, senators and congressmen and women from our region. The number of representatives on both sides of the aisle, including Senator Johnson, who said, hey, we got to do something about immigration. We need an immigration system that will feed the needs of our economy. I mean, Senator Johnson, as you said, is a pretty conservative guy. He's talked my ear off on how important immigration is to his state. So he represents Wisconsin, and he says if Wisconsin doesn't have more workers, Wisconsin's economy is not going to grow. And so that's why we invited Senator Johnson to come to the bank at our immigration-oriented conference, because here's somebody who you might think is not in favor of immigration. He says, look, we need a legal immigration system that meets the needs of our economy. And so we thought he'd be a good person to hear from.
Thank you, and welcome everyone on behalf of the Minneapolis Foundation. We are so pleased to be a partner today in this conversation. So Steve, thank you also for including us. And my question is about the different communities you're traveling to, wondering whether you're seeing examples of where immigration is working. And could you share some of learnings that you've seen that might be helpful for others to know about?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ellen. Especially when I go across rural Minnesota and the other states, a lot of them are concerned that their populations are declining because young people go to the cities for college, they go to cities for economic opportunity, maybe they don't go back later in life. And they say, what's going to happen to our towns? Well, there are a handful of towns that have really embraced immigration successfully, and their populations are growing. So over the summer, we went to Worthington, Minnesota, which has focused on immigration for a few decades, really to staff the meatpacking plants that they have there in town. And they've figured it out. I mean, they've been at it now. They told me, we had a town hall with the mayor and other city leaders. They've been at it for 20 or 30 years. But if you look at the elementary schools, the schools are growing. Now, they're very diverse, and that brings different challenges when people speak different languages, so it's not without its challenges. But they've had a focused strategy for 20 or 30 years, and their economy is growing, their town is growing, their schools are full of kids, people are feeling good. And so I thought that was a really interesting example that it can work with a very focused strategy. But I asked the mayor, I said, what's the secret? He said the secret is we've been doing it for 20 years. It doesn't happen overnight. And there are always going to be some growing pains associated with it, but you absolutely can do it successfully. And so that was a great thing to see.
I'm going to follow up for 1 second. I'm actually going to ask you a question, Ellen, and that is Minneapolis Foundation. See, you put yourself at risk here. Minneapolis Foundation hosted a whole event, a conference about global Minneapolis, right? Isn't that true? And so global city. So how does that relate? So here you have the Minneapolis Foundation trying to organize around making Minneapolis a global city, even more global city. How does it relate to immigration, maybe from a cultural viewpoint?
I mean, I think it's, the Twin Cities is a very special place. We've got people from all over the world. I think it's a very welcoming community. I think it's a vibrant business community. I've never seen a business community that's as civically engaged as I've seen here. So I think there are huge strengths. You've got the University of Minnesota, which brings in talent from all around the world. So I think all the pieces are here. And if you look at the projections of the diversity of the Minnesota population, it's going to become increasingly diverse. You know, there's no stopping it going forward, which is great. It does present its own challenges, and we have to learn to adapt in certain ways. So I think all the elements are here. I'm not sure, Ellen, if there are other angles that you all focused on in your event. Would love to hear about that.
Well, thank you. I don't think this was supposed to be a commercial for the Minneapolis Foundation, but since it's being handed to me on a platter, I will take the opportunity. Really to say that the Minneapolis Foundation hosted a convening around the global city and really trying to look at how Minneapolis has a number of immigrant populations that are an asset to our community, but also to Minneapolis serving as a global community. And so how can we connect and be a place that's a global city and take advantage of, you know, the opportunities that we have as a global city. And I think, frankly, looking at the people in this room, we have an amazing community. And so the global convening was really about highlighting this community and all the assets, including the immigrants that are in this community that make our city a global city.
Questions? Audience? Bob.
The microphone's coming to you.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much. These were great comments. I'd like to ask or focus on the role of immigrants as producers in the economy. If there are studies or on the differences economically in immigrants in terms of new business formation, in terms of employment opportunities, capital formation, if you can make some comments, not simply on immigrants as consumers, but on the producer side, and the degree to which immigrants differ from their U.S. counterparts, first thing. Second issue I'd like to know is if you have any comments, again, simply from an economic perspective, on the role of immigrants versus refugees in terms of economic contributions.
So the first one I can answer. The second one I'm not sure. The first one, I was just speaking to my research director about this earlier this morning. On average, if you just look on average, immigrants to America are more educated than the native population. On average, they start more businesses. On average, they have more Nobel Prizes that they've won, et cetera. And that's including the entire immigrant population. That's not simply saying, let's take the highly skilled immigrant, the college graduates, et cetera. If you lump everybody together, the averages are better. So I mean, I think the contribution is clearly there. And the low-hanging fruit, and this is one that, you know, it's frustrating that Republicans and Democrats can agree on something and still nothing gets done. Almost everybody that I've met agrees that it's insane that we educate people here with a master's or a PhD, and then we send them home to compete against us, right? That's the definition of insanity. So starting by saying, let's keep those folks here, working at our Medtronics and our General Mills, et cetera, and starting businesses here, that's an obvious one that can really be a supply side boost to our economy. In terms of the difference between refugees and other immigrant populations, I don't know. Maybe there have been studies done. I'm unaware of it. That doesn't mean that the data isn't there. I just don't know.
I'm sorry. Is there some way that we can be effective in getting to the press, the media, such that whenever there are stories, they're not necessarily about illegal immigrants being involved in the DWI or the SALT, and the stress being on the fact that these are foreign nationals, because as we all know, Americans, native-born Americans, also engage in domestic assault and murder and mayhem and so forth and so on. So my question is, what do you suggest we do to engage the press to talk more about the positive aspects of immigration?
Well, it's a great question. It's, the press, my personal opinion, I think the press reflects our preferences. You know, if you see a car crash on the side of the road, it's hard not to look at it. And so I think that the press reflects our own human tendencies to be more enamored by the terrible stories than the good stories. I'm I don't know. I don't have a good answer other than to say we should all vote. We should all participate in the political process and the electoral process and make sure that our voices are heard however we can. I don't know how to get the press to focus on the good stories versus the car accidents, unfortunately. We have a reporter right here. He can answer for all reporters.
Abby?
Thank you very much. At the risk of pointing out the obvious, there seems to be a disconnect between your words and opinions and the current administration on immigration, to say the least. How do you and your colleagues at the Fed, in terms of economic policy, or when you go back to Washington, you said, what, every 6 weeks? How do you address those issues in the room? Because it's clear that there is an opposition going on.
So we have to walk, and I try to walk a delicate line, which is Congress has basically said to the Fed, we are going to put monetary policy in your hands, make decisions based on data and analysis, not politics, leave the politics to us. So that's why when I weigh into an issue like immigration, I'm just trying to do the math. I just want to arm our elected leaders with the best data and analysis that I can so that they can make whatever decisions that they think are appropriate. But at the end of the day, they are the ones to make these decisions, representing all of you, representing all of us. And so, it's a little bit of a fine line that we have to walk. Monetary policy is really our bailiwick. When we get involved in these other issues, it really is meant to be neutral analyzers of data and analysis and saying, here's what the analysis says. Now, elected officials, it's up to you to choose what you want to do with that. Not a very satisfying answer, I can see by your expression, but it's a very honest answer. Well, I think, we are a democracy. And at the end of the day, the people's voices ultimately need to carry the day through their elected representatives. And that's ultimately it. And the fact of the matter is, why is Washington, D.C. so divided right now? Because the people are divided. And that's, in some sense, Washington is working. It's reflecting the fact that there are real divisions in our country, difference of opinion.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Kashkari. Welcome to Minnesota. I hope you are enjoying the winter.
I've been here 3 years, so I'm not quite so new.
Okay.
I know in context of Minnesota, that's very recent, but
Right. Full disclosure, I am an immigrant, so I am asking this question on behalf of everybody. I came here about 20 years ago with just $20 in my pocket and a return ticket. Fortunately, I never have to use the return ticket. I am a citizen now. I understand the United States economy in general heavily dependent on the underlying premise of immigrant workers. Could you tell us, if we stop letting these immigrants come to our country, help in various facilities such as meat packing in Worthington or in Iowa or Central Valley in California, what will happen to our everyday life? Will we still be able to buy beef and throw it on charcoal, or can we eat the lettuce that was served today? So if you could just highlight on that, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
I think you would see, if there was no immigration, if we went to zero, in fact, I talked about this with our research director this morning, the native-born population is not having babies to keep up with our aging. So our population would decline. And if our population is declining, first of all of our entitlement programs basically go bust because our entitlement programs are funded by current workers paying for current retirees. And as those ratios go into the red, those programs become insolvent, number one. Number two, you have other fixed costs, like I mentioned, such as infrastructure and defense. It becomes much, much harder to afford to pay for those. And then number three, the prices that we pay for different goods, for example, produce, agriculture, et cetera, those are all going to go up probably dramatically. And so I think the U.S. economy, a market economy depends on growth. We don't really know how to have a market economy that does not grow. We need that growth. And if we're not going to have enough kids ourselves, it's got to come from immigration.
Almost everybody likes economic growth, but more and more people these days are becoming more and more concerned about the wealth and income gaps. Could you address that and how the Federal Reserve Bank looks upon that?
Yeah, it's an issue that we care a lot about. In fact, one of my big surprises coming to Minnesota, Minnesota has so many strengths, so many things going for us, a very diverse economy, overall a very educated workforce, yet we have some of the worst gaps, racial gaps, regional gaps in the country. And I wanted to understand why these gaps are there and why they've been so persistent. I mean, there's been a lot of effort to try to close these gaps over the last few decades, and there's been, if we're honest with one another, there's been no measurable progress in closing the gaps. And so I don't have a good answer for you other than we have launched a major new research center at the Minneapolis Fed focusing on understanding why these gaps exist, why they're so persistent, what are the best policy solutions from around the country that might be showing promise that we could bring back to Minnesota. We know education is a big part of it. We know that different kids in different neighborhoods, where you happen to be growing up, has a huge factor, determining factor on the quality of the education you get. Now, that doesn't strike me as the right solution. It shouldn't be that way, but it is that way today. So we know education is a big part of it. But what are the other factors? It does get involved in housing. It does get involved in transportation. It does get involved in healthcare. A lot of these things either reinforce one another for the better or for the worse. So they're typically multifaceted. But this is an area where I wish I had a clear-cut answer for you, but it's a big focus for us at the Minneapolis Fed.
I have a question pertaining to higher education, post-secondary education. So I'm hearing that we're seeing some reductions in the numbers of students coming over from foreign countries into our universities and post-secondary. So I'd love you to comment on that as well as sort of your perspective on the importance and role of post-secondary education.
Well, I think post-secondary education is only becoming more important. And whether that is a 2-year community college or that's a 4-year, or that's getting a PhD, we are a knowledge economy. We're increasingly more knowledge-oriented. Education is only going to be more important in the future than it is today and than it has been in the past. That we're not changing that. That's the future, and we know that. So education is enormously important. Again, a huge source of a big competitive edge for America was that we could attract the best and the brightest from around the world who wanted to come to our universities. Right? The University of Minnesota is, if I could pick one institution in the state of Minnesota that is important for our future economic competitiveness, it's the U. Right? That's the engine of our technology development in many ways. And so we need to keep attracting the best and brightest to Minnesota and to our best universities around the country. And if we don't, they'll go to Canada. They'll go to Australia. They'll go to Europe. I'd rather them come here. That doesn't mean everybody who wants to come gets to come. But if we use our universities as a filter to say, hey, we're going to attract the very best and brightest from around the world, we'd be crazy to turn our backs on that.
Thank you. And Neel, thanks for your comments. And in particular, I'm appreciative of your endorsement of immigration as a economic growth strategy. My question is that as this country has begun wrestling with immigration generally, the polarization has become disaggregated to the point where we begin to think even subliminally about good immigrants versus bad immigrants. We think about, so I don't know what image people's had in their head when we are talking about immigration generally, but we think about southern border immigrants versus those who come in through the east or through the west or through the north. And my concern is that we know that even among immigrants, that there are economic disparities within the immigrant community itself. But what I heard from you was a broad and general and even a specific endorsement of immigration as a strategy for economic growth. And I am not aware of, even though the current debate seems to imply that there's a disaggregation between the economic benefits associated with H-1B visa immigrants versus those who come in via lottery. And so I'm interested in your comments about whether or not there is, or whether you're aware of data or studies underway, or some inherent assumption that is basically correct that would suggest that there's sort of healthy immigration or good immigration for this country versus bad immigration?
So it's a good question, Steve. I have not, when we've looked at it, basically the data that we've looked at has said all of the above is good for America. I have not come across information that seems robust that says this kind of immigration is bad and this kind of immigration is good. The fact is, as the gentleman earlier said, we need all types of immigrants to feed our economy, right? That's true. And so when I talk about if I were in charge and I got to say I'm going to design the immigration system that I want, I would design an immigration system that meets the needs of our economy. And that's both very high skilled, but that's also less skilled folks, because we need those workers in our economy doing important work that we all benefit from. So I don't have a more specific answer than that, but as we've looked at it, it's an all of the above strategy.
Mr. Kashkari, thanks so much for being here. My question is really about the outsourcing, the connection between outsourcing and immigration. I know here in the Twin Cities we have this greater MSP organization that's trying to make sure companies keep their people here and that they build new facilities here. I know Polaris was encouraged to stay here, but there's a relationship between immigration and outsourcing, where a company might not be getting the talent that they need here at the cost that they want here, so they look to China or they look to South Korea. And there's certain clusters where they do that. Micro manufacturing is one of the clusters, but there's others. I don't know about all of them. But I guess my question is really about what type of research is the Fed doing to pay attention to that outsourcing at the intersection of immigration?
We pay a lot of attention to these global trends, especially as it relates to productivity growth. I'll give you an example. So when a new technology is invented here, it can often be adopted around the world fairly quickly, or if a new technology is invented in India or China or Europe. And so we do pay a lot of attention to technology development around the world, and people may be moving. Maybe it's optimal to have a call center in the Philippines, and you have the U.S. workers doing the design aspects of this. So I understand that some of these outsourcing discussions are unsettling, because someone might say, well, boy, I had this job here and now it's being moved to Mexico or it's being moved to China. But I just tell you, for the long-term competitiveness of the U.S., creating a policy where it says, no, we're going to do all of the low-value stuff here just because we did it here historically, will actually lead to a less competitive U.S. economy than if you allow businesses to optimize and say, you know what, we're going to keep the services and the design elements here that we are uniquely good at, and then we're going to put the other parts in other parts of the world where they are uniquely good at those things. It ends up being a more robust global economy and a more competitive U.S. economy. Now, I say that, and I admit, for an individual family that's affected by the fact that their factory might move to Mexico or might move to China, that's not a very satisfying answer. But in terms of the long-term health of the U.S. economy, allowing businesses to take advantage of where there are these competitive benefits, the U.S. economy is overall better for it.
Hi. This is a question about refugees, perhaps more than immigrants. The examples that have been given of Worthington and elsewhere have mainly focused on people in low-skilled jobs. However, there are refugees with legal status and citizens here who arrived here from highly skilled backgrounds, and they struggle to resume those fields, law, medicine, engineering, because of credentialing, licensing, other challenges, and they're forced into low-skilled jobs even though we need them everywhere. How can we do better at matching people and reintegrating people into those professional paths?
Well, the topic of occupational licensing, this is a topic that we care a lot about at the Minneapolis Fed, not only for refugees, for all Americans, for all Minnesotans, as an example. Well, I'll keep going. And the reason is, boy, the louder I talk, the louder he's going to go. The reason is that over time, these licenses and these license requirements have just multiplied and multiplied and multiplied, and it's a real barrier to bringing people into the workforce. There's anecdotes of different states where you have to be a licensed florist, allegedly for safety reasons, right? Why do they do that? Because the existing florists want to keep competitors out. I visited a lot of colleges and community colleges around the region. I visited a community college in southern Minnesota, and I asked the president of the community college, I said, what's your most in-demand course? He said it was a radiology technician. And I said, okay, great, that sounds like a good job. Why don't you expand your radiology technician program? He said, because the National Radiology Technician Accreditation Body will not allow us to increase our program because they want to limit supply to keep wages up for the existing pool of radiology technicians in the country. So this issue of occupational, now clearly there are some occupations you want to have robust standards. Don't get me wrong, we're not going to do away with all licensing, but it's gone so extreme that these are just barriers to competition. And I think it affects the refugees that you talked about, but I think it affects all of us. And this is a topic that's getting increasing conversation, so I'm cautiously optimistic that we can throttle it back and make it more sensible.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Kashkari. I'm also an immigrant, so I can assure the meeting here that we're doing quite well when we come here with, I'm a small business owner, and we came here 30 years ago. Me and my wife had degrees in electrical engineering. We're doing really well. Thank you. The question is about the designing the immigration system that would fit the needs of the economy. We have essentially legal documented immigrants and a significant number of undocumented. How can you model, and I know quite a bit about modeling, how would you model the system where a significant part of information is not available? I assume we don't know a lot about those undocumented.
Well, I think there's a couple elements of the underlying question. One element is, what do you do with the undocumented immigrants who are here today? And I think that's part of the conversation, which is there some grand bargain to be had where you provide a path for legal status for the folks who are here today? And then my personal opinion is you do need a legal immigration system that meets the needs of the economy. And if you can do that successfully, that should reduce the illegal immigrant ongoing population so that there's not this current new influx of folks that are in the shadows, in effect. You know, other people have talked about it in the past. We had programs with guest workers who would come in and work different farm jobs and then be able to go home. I think there are a number of different ways of designing this, but long term, I don't think it's healthy to have a robust legal system and then ongoing an illegal system in parallel with that. Hopefully you can design a legal system that actually meets the needs of the economy. If you do that, then there's no need for the illegal system that would be working around it.
Question on productivity. There's sort of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, leads to growth, but on the other hand, displaces a lot of workers as well, and perhaps limits the number of type of jobs that people might be able to come into, driverless trucks and other things like that that we see on the horizon. So as you're looking at modeling and planning, what do you look at in terms of the displacement that's going to occur from improvements in productivity and technology?
So I'm not a believer in the end of labor story. I don't believe that robots are going to put us all out of business and the driverless trucks are going to all of a sudden, we're going to have millions of unemployed truck drivers. I know there are some Silicon Valley luminaries who like to make these kind of predictions. People have been predicting the end of labor for most of human history. So when mechanization went into agriculture, people said, oh my gosh, all the farm workers are going to be out of work. Well, their jobs changed. They moved into factories and the nature of work changed, but labor still had a very important role to play. So I personally believe our economy is dynamic. There's disruption all the time. That disruption can be very painful for those immediately impacted, but I think that there's still going to be a very, very important role for workers, though increasing premium to education. So you're going to need to increasingly have more and more skills. But I'm bullish on the American workforce, not worrying about the apocalypse. And I know you didn't say that, but some people say that.
Mr. Kashkari, Ed Graff, Minneapolis Public Schools. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Just some context before my question. Minneapolis Public Schools, roughly 35,000 students, a large population of immigrant families, students in our district. 20 to 50% are refugees. We recently had over 1,700 students be recognized as biliterate, getting a seal of biliteracy. So all that context, recognizing where we are as a country, the DACA issue and how that has affected our students and the impact that has on their learning, their ability to learn, what educational policies do you see being critical to change this trajectory of how they feel in our country and in our schools. Obviously, what's recently been said has had a negative effect on them, and we've had to do a lot of work to bridge that relationship with our families and our students to feel safe. But are there policies out there that should be taking us on a different path nationally that we haven't been talking about?
But are you, just to be, I want to make sure I understood the question, are you talking about education policies per se?
Education.
Or education policies?
As economics productivity is based in education, do you have any in your mind or in your conversation that you've heard that should be looked at?
I mean, it's hard for me to think about crafting a national education policy that would work for the whole country, for all these cities, for all the richness that you experience here that might be unique to the Minneapolis, might be different from St. Louis or different from Chicago. And so I think as much local control as possible so that you as the local school leader and the principals that work with you and the school board that you work with can design the curriculum, the strategies, the family engagement to meet the customized needs. I mean, the Hmong community, as an example, here in Minnesota is a wonderful, rich part of our community. Doesn't exist in most of America, right? It's just a very different communities there. And so it's hard for me to think of one thing that's going to work everywhere, but giving you as much local power as you possibly can have to tailor those strategies for your students and your families. That's my best idea off the top of my head, but I'd love to talk to you more about it offline if you have ideas. Thank you.
Neel, I note that we're at about 1:12, 1:13. We're scheduled to adjourn at 1:15. Shall we take one more question? Okay. Brian.
It's hard to adjourn without at least one economic question as long as you're in the room.
Sure. I'll repeat the question since you don't have a mic.
I listened to Jay Paul as I was driving in the economic of Washington, and there's tremendous pressure by the media, by certain politicians in Washington, even though you folks are data dependent. So even though you're data dependent and make your decisions independently, there's a lot of pressure on your goal of determining interest rates and controlling inflation. So I don't think you're a voting person this year, correct?
That's correct.
But you've been fairly, maybe I don't know the words outspoken, but have your opinions on where we need to be, and the Fed seems to be walking back a little bit right now. I don't know if it's they don't really listen to the pressure, but maybe data is changing. Can you at least give us a little comment on where you think things might go in the next year?
Sure. So the gentleman's asking a question about monetary policy. I've been pretty outspoken over the last couple of years saying I didn't see pressures building in the economy that would justify rate increases. So let's just take our time. The biggest surprise that's really surprised all of us has been how strong the job market has been in the U.S. economy over the last couple of years. You know, traditionally the headline unemployment rate that gets a lot of attention has been a pretty good measure of is there slack in the economy. So the headline unemployment rate right now is 3.9%. That's quite low historically. That would suggest there's no more slack. Everybody who wants to find a job is able to find a job. But the trick is that unemployment rate only counts people who are actively looking for work. So if you gave up looking because of the great financial crisis, you're not counted. So what's been amazing is over the last few years, the U.S. economy has been creating 200,000 jobs a month. 300,000 last month actually, but 200,000 a month after month after month. We only need 100,000 a month to keep up with population growth. So what's been happening is people have been coming off the sidelines who are not counted in the unemployment statistic and taking jobs. That's fantastic. And so my basic message is let's let that keep going as long as possible, because the more Americans we have working, the better for them, the better for all of us. So the reason I've been opposed to rate increases, as I've said, there might be a lot more people out there that we just don't know that are uncounted. Let's go figure that out. And if we see inflationary pressures building, we can always raise the rates then. So I think that story has proven to be pretty true. It continues to be true. And I think some of the economic signals have suggested a slowdown in the global economy. And I think that is adding up, saying, hey, maybe we can just take it easy a little bit, see how the economy evolves before we continue raising interest rates. But I didn't listen. I was coming in here, so I didn't get to hear what Chairman Powell said earlier today. So maybe he said something different, but we'll see. We'll talk later.
Let's have a round of applause for Neel Kashkari.
Thank you very much.